Laura Lengnick has investigated agricultural sustainability for more than 30 years. Her research in soil quality and sustainable farming systems was nationally recognized with the USDA Secretary's Honor Award, and she was the lead author of the 2012 USDA report, Climate Change in U.S. Agriculture, Effects and Adaptation. Her new book, Resilient Agriculture, Cultivating Food Systems for a Changing Climate, explores the latest climate science and resilience thinking through the adaptation stories of 25 award-winning sustainable producers located across the U.S. Today, Laura's going to be talking to us about ecosystem-based management options. So take it away, Laura.
Okay, thanks, Dan. It's good to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about ecosystem-based mitigation options rather than thinking about management options, although it is a management, ecosystem-based mitigation is a management approach to a management approach in terms of managing natural resources to achieve mitigation. In the fifth assessment report, the IPCC, the mitigation report, the authors recognize that in agriculture, the most cost-effective mitigation options are management options and the restoration of organic soils. Those would be peatland soils, wetland soils, those kinds of soils. So agriculture can contribute to mitigation in three important ways, and we can manage agricultural systems to increase sequestration. That's the storage of carbon in the soils, removed from the atmosphere and stored in soils, in biomass on the farm, both above and below ground, in harvested products. And also, we want to think about, as we're managing sequestration, how do we protect or preserve that carbon so that it's not released back to the atmosphere as much as we practically can. A second way that agriculture can contribute to mitigation is emissions reduction. And emission reductions you've just heard about can be reduced through effective manure and feed management. Think more carefully about efficient fertilizer application, because methane and nitrous oxide emissions, those are the three, feed management, manure management, and fertilizer applications are three of the main sources of those types of emissions. Can also improve fuel-efficient technologies and practices. And then one addition I would make to this is that if the farm system is able to reduce the purchase of inputs that require a lot of energy to make, like nitrogen fertilizers, that would be yet another way the farm can reduce emissions kind of within the input chain that it's managing. And then finally, a third way is to substitute fossil fuels with biofuels. So what is ecosystem-based mitigation? It's the management of ecosystems for their carbon storage and sequestration services. So when we're thinking about ecosystem-based mitigation in agriculture, we're thinking about the farm as an ecosystem. And another word for that is that you often see when you're reading about ecosystem-based mitigation is agroecosystem, and that's just a managed ecosystem, a farm or ranch system, ecosystem. It's most often the most cost-effective mitigation option, and this would be just in general globally. What kinds of options are available and how cost-effective they are is very locally driven. So everything that I say today about ecosystem mitigation is the results in a particular place, in a particular time, in a particular system will vary depending on many factors. Another quality of ecosystem mitigation is, besides the mitigation benefits of these practices, there are many co-benefits. Ecosystem-based mitigation practices tend to increase the overall productivity and profitability of the farm, tends to reduce purchased inputs, promotes biodiversity, enhances water resources, and also can buffer climate effects. And I'll talk about more, specific examples of these as I move through the presentation. So one reason that ecosystem-based mitigation is the most cost-effective, often the most cost-effective, is because of these many other co-benefits that come along with the mitigation that's achieved with the practices. So agricultural managers can influence soil carbon sequestration in kind of 4 key ways. And so this would be more of just the management logic for improving soil sequestration, which is a main method of ecosystem-based mitigation. And those 4 ways are you're aiming to decrease the level of soil disturbance, so that you are protecting the soil, the carbon that is in soils. You're increasing the mass and quality of plant and animal inputs to soils, improving soil microbial diversity and abundance, and maintaining continuous living plant cover on soils year-round. And this last point is really it's pretty recent that research is really showing us how important having particularly living roots in the soil in terms of really taking advantage of the sequestration potential of soils. So ecosystem-based mitigation asks us to think about a farm or a ranch as a whole system. And so you can't really pull out one individual practice and say that that practice alone is going to provide you with effective mitigation. It's really a suite of practices in combination that act in complementary ways. So even though I may talk about a particular practice throughout this presentation, it's really with the understanding that it's within the context of a whole system. Some of the agricultural systems that have been shown to particularly have the ability to sequester carbon through ecosystem strategies are listed here. And conventional conservation tillage and no-till, so reduced tillage systems, with cover crops and compost. The most recent research that I've seen shows that reduced tillage alone doesn't sequester that much carbon. You've really got to combine that with growing cover crops or adding compost. Organic farming systems, because there's more emphasis in these systems on using compost, growing cover crops, are another system that has a lot of capacity to sequester carbon. Diversified crop rotations, so very diverse crop rotations, mixing grain crops with legumes, crops and forages, perennials and annuals. Those kinds of diversified crop rotations tend to be able to sequester carbon. And not just an unplanned mix of diversity, but they really need to be complementary diversity in order to achieve the mitigation through ecosystem-based practices. Rotational grazing is another practice, but it's really a system that has been shown to have good carbon sequestration capacity, along with production of perennials, any kind of perennial crops. Agroforestry, there's a whole suite of practices that I'll discuss later in agroforestry that have been shown to have good carbon sequestration potential. And then kind of at the largest landscape scale, there's a practice or an approach, a set of strategies that fall under farmscaping, which I'll also discuss further. So I had a chance to see examples of all of these different sorts of systems that I've just described in action in some case study work that I did a few years ago and reported last summer, reported in a book, Resilient Agriculture, that was released last summer in June of 2015. And so what I wanted to do with most of the remaining time today in this presentation is to just walk you through some of these different systems and show you some on-the-ground examples of how ecosystem-based strategies are actually in use on these different farms. This set of case studies, these farmers were all award-winning sustainable farmers, and they are located all over the country. So what you will see is that, as I said, the locale, the system, the locale has a huge influence on what kinds of ecosystem-based approaches work and how they look on the ground. And actually, I wanted to say one more thing. One of the things that I really like about this list of different kinds of systems that sequester carbon is really any type of farmer or rancher, no matter where you're at with your management, there's something on this list where you can begin to think more if you'd like to think about how you might benefit from ecosystem-based mitigation. You can choose some place in this list to kind of get started. And so I've also arranged these cases kind of from the least change from a conventional system to the most change, the most complex ecosystem-based approaches. So Brendan Rocky grows 500 acres of irrigated potatoes in the high desert region of Colorado. He gets about 5 inches of natural rainfall per year there, and that's in a normal year. However, the area has been in a 17-year drought, and the whole region is facing declining water supplies. So what Brendan did was he decided to add cover crops to the standard rotation in the area, which was barley, a 2-year rotation of barley and potatoes. He decided, because of the declining water supplies, to replace the barley phase of the rotation, add some diversity with a cover crop mix, a very diverse cover crop cocktail mix. He decided to remove barley because, as he said, it was the thirsty crop in the mix. So he thought that of the 2 crops, that was the best one for him to replace with cover crops. What he found is that after a few years, soil quality improved so much in this on his farm that he was able to reduce water used in the potatoes, fertilizer and pesticide inputs, and so his profits were increased. So he is looking now to changing up the next things he wanted to change up and add in terms of diversity to his farm is insectary intercrops and potatoes. So now he's actually moving into the potato crop and adding some diversity there. And so what you're seeing in terms of ecosystem-based management for mitigation is the cover crops. The soil is covered more throughout the year with living roots. You've got this diverse mix of cover crops, so they're increasing the mass and the quality. There's more diversity of organic materials being added to the soil. And because the soil quality is increased, he's using less water, he's using less electricity, and he's been able to reduce the purchased fertilizer and pesticide inputs, so all that embodied energy in those materials has reduced. So overall, it's likely that the footprint of this farm has been reduced. Emissions footprint has been reduced. So this is just one example of a farm in which we've just added cover crops as a way to begin to mitigate emissions. This is Gary and Linda Price. They ranch in Texas, and they're an example of restoring native prairie, using rotational grazing, and restoring riparian areas or managing for riparian areas as ways to use ecosystem-based mitigation strategies. And I should say too that none of these farmers and ranchers that I'm going to talk about today thought about their practices as mitigating greenhouse gases. They were thinking more about building resilience, but they all are examples of ecosystem-based mitigation. And I'd say that's true in general, that when you look, if you go out to look in what's been written, case studies of ecosystem-based mitigation, there are a lot of projects out there that are using these strategies and achieving good mitigation based on natural resource management. But there are very few, particularly in the U.S., that are using the language of ecosystem-based mitigation. So this is, as I said, Gary and Linda Price, 77 Ranch. They restored 2,000 acres of native prairie, and they have a 190 cow-calf herd. They're producing calves. There's been tremendous increase in this transformation of this ranch back to native prairie in CO2, carbon storage in the soil, and carbon storage above ground. This is a region that had the really intense drought and heat waves in 2011, 2012, and they were one of the few ranches in the area that did not destock during that. So again, lots of resilience. Thinking about co-benefits to ecosystem-based mitigation. Gary's also involved in a regional effort. It's to build water resources, improve the quantity and quality of water resources in the region. It's a Sand County Foundation program. It's called Water as a Crop. And so this would be another co-benefit of managing for soil sequestration and increased carbon sequestration above and below ground, is that this ranch is involved in a regional effort to improve water resources in the area and reduce flooding in the area. Trantham has Happy Cow Creamery in Palzer, South Carolina, and he is using a practice called pasture cropping, along with rotational grazing and diverse crop rotation. So these are the three tools or within his system of pasture-based dairy contributing to ecosystem-based mitigation. He has a 90 cow herd on about a 100-acre farm, 95 acres in paddocks, using intensive grazing. And he is he's no-tilling annual forages, short season annual forages into a standing Bermuda grass pasture. So that's the pasture cropping part of his system. Again, you're seeing, as you think about the system, year-round living roots, soil is covered and protected year-round from any erosion, staying cooler. So we're again protecting that and building that carbon that's being captured by the crops and then sequestered in the soil. Gabe Brown has 5,000 acres of prairie, native prairie, restored native prairie, and also cultivated land on his ranch in Bismarck, North Dakota. He is using an even greater number of these suite of practices that are associated with ecosystem-based mitigation: no-till, cover crop cocktails, diverse rotations, very diverse rotations, rotational grazing, and restored native prairie. He is one of the few farmers, I think, in the nation. I've not been able to find very many examples of farms that have actually tracked changes in carbon and other soil quality measures over time in these kinds of very diverse cropping systems or farm systems. But he's one, and looking over the 20 years that he's been transitioning the ranch, the soil organic matter levels have increased from about 2% to about 6% on average over the ranch, which is a huge storage of carbon in the soil. And some of those co-benefits include an infiltration rate that has gone from 0.5 inches per hour to 8 inches per hour, which is an enormous increase in the capacity of his ranch to receive water at whatever intensity of rainfall, receive it, infiltrate it, store it, and make it available for his crops. Another thing you can think about in terms of co-benefits is of this kind of increase in soil quality is the ranch is also contributing to less flooding downstream as rainfall events become less frequent and more intense in the region. Jim Coan grows apples and produces fresh apples, cider, hard cider, and apple finished pork in this perennial production system. He's got 500 acres, certified organic orchard and farm. He's using a Swedish sandwich system for orchard floor management, which keeps the orchard floor covered all through the year. And he also pastures his pigs in the orchard. They are both providing nutrients in their manure, and also they eat drops, and so they're his number one pest management strategy. So again, we've got an example here of a very diversified, integrated, perennial production system with a great capacity for mitigating emissions and storing carbon. Alex and Betsy Hitt own Peregrine Farm. It's located in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And their farm is a good example of a system that's using diversified organic rotation, very intensive cover crops, and mixing perennials, and also some livestock into the system as a way to create this ecosystem-based approach to mitigation. They have 26 acres of croplands, pastures, and woodlands, 5 acres in intensive production of fresh vegetables and flowers. They have a 10-year rotation. It's a very complex and complementary rotation, and it's very high in use of cover crops. Sometimes 4 cover crops are grown, 3 to 4 cover crops are grown in any one year as part of that rotation. And this last example is Full Belly Farm. It's in Gwenda, California. It's a little north of San Francisco on the west side of Central Valley. And this Full Belly Farm is an example of kind of a full use of all of these different approaches, systems approaches that can reduce emissions. And they're using organic farming, diversified rotations, perennial crops, agroforestry, rotational grazing, and farmscaping, all on this 400-acre organic farm. Features in the landscape, so they are really put a focus on looking at diversity, biodiversity across the farm landscape over time and over space. And the main features in this landscape that add a lot of biodiversity are perennial orchards mixed with annual crops, pastures, hedgerows, and riparian areas are all present on this farm. I also just wanted to talk a little bit about agroforestry and also farmscaping. Agroforestry is a set of strategies that, again, can be introduced in many farm systems as an ecosystem-based approach to mitigation. The mitigation is accomplished by adding woody plants to what otherwise would be either perennial grass kind of a landscape or annual crop landscape. There's specific kinds of strategies, and these are, you're seeing images of these different strategies. You can add riparian buffers around surface water as a way to begin to store carbon both above ground and below ground. And then again, remember there's a whole suite of co-benefits to all of these practices as well. In the case of riparian buffers, you're protecting water quality, for example. Windbreaks can be a very useful way to just increase carbon storage both above and below ground on a very small fraction of land, and again, lots of co-benefits. Particularly, these kinds of co-benefits for windbreaks and riparian buffers are going to only increase in the future if climate change, if the pace and intensity of climate change increases as projected. Alley cropping is another example. You're seeing, let's see, again, these are just two images of alley cropping. So you're growing crops, annual crops or perennial crops. This is corn and hay, growing in between alleys of some other kind of a tree crop. In this case, it's black locust, and in this case, it's pecans. It's a young pecan orchard. So that's what alley cropping looks like. Silvopasture is grazing animals through a pasture with trees. And then the last example of agroforestry is forest farming. And this term is used in agroforestry literature to mean it's a forest, its canopy's been opened as much as needs to be to grow some sort of a non-timber product of forest crop. So agroforestry offers an array of strategies for increasing carbon sequestration on the farm by introducing woody perennials to the farm. And then the last set of tools I wanted to mention is farmscaping, and this is a strategy that really takes into account the entire farm landscape, and the manager thinks about how to manage that entire landscape, all the water courses, the whole farm landscape as a whole, field edges, if there's any forests on the land, how are we managing those lands in order to sequester carbon. So farmscaping, you might see, for example, some wetlands restoration going on. You might see some more specific management of field edges, or one example of a pretty unique and dramatic use of farmscaping would be New Forest Farm, Mark Shepard's New Forest Farm, which is in Wisconsin, and he is actually he's using alley cropping and other agroforestry methods to completely rescape his what was just a standard corn and soybean farm in Wisconsin, to return the farm to more of a oak savanna type agro ecosystem while maintaining production, crop and livestock production on the farm. So the specific mitigation benefits of these different systems of production, organic farming systems, conventional no-till and reduced tillage systems with cover crops and compost. These different examples that I've given you, there's a lot of conflicting research or gaps in knowledge about the real mitigation potential of these different ecosystem-based strategies. And I think Mark's presentation right before this one, he gave a great example of all the assumptions and the different ways you can look at emissions data and come up with kind of different answers to how well a particular system does or doesn't mitigate. In any case, the mitigation potential always depends on some very specific local characteristics: soil type, regional climate, production system, and the way these all interact. That's one important thing to remember if you want to get into thinking about how to manage a system for the mitigation potential using ecosystem-based strategies. But all of that said, there was a recent literature review that pulled together information from different production systems, different locations, and tried to do a kind of a meta-analysis of what was possible. So we're looking at, well, I said meta-analysis, but actually they're looking at kind of what's the potential of these systems. So what are some best case examples? So I just want to share a few of these with you. So a system that replaces synthetic fertilizers with nitrogen-fixing cover crops can reduce CO2 emissions by up to 50%. Organic farming systems can reduce energy use up to 30% and sequester 50% more soil carbon than conventional no-till systems. Soils amended with animal manures, compost, and cover crops can store more soil carbon than soils amended with synthetic fertilizers. Restored native grasslands store more carbon than improved pastures. Grass-fed livestock systems can reduce energy use up to 50% and reduce methane and nitrous oxide emissions compared to conventional feedlot systems. And riparian and hedgerow habitats with woody vegetation, so adding woody vegetation to a farmscape, can store up to 20% of total farm carbon on less than 6% of total farm area. So these riparian areas and other edges with woody vegetation become this very intensive site of carbon storage and sequestration. And riparian areas with woody vegetation can store up to 25% more carbon than adjacent cropland and 100% more than adjacent grasslands. So if you'd like to learn more about the potential for ecosystem-based mitigation options, there are several places that you can go to get information about specific practices. The NRCS has a pretty good site showing with climate change resources in general, tools and services available through the NRCS. The USDA Climate Smart Agriculture Plan looks like there's potential in that plan for supporting ecosystem-based mitigation. The plan provides incentives and technical assistance to farmers, ranchers, and forest land owners with the goal of, by 2025, reducing net emissions and enhancing carbon sequestration by 120 million metric tons. And that's the equivalent of 25 million cars taken off the road. So that's a great place to go and just see. Let's see specifically the 3 of the 10 building blocks of this plan speak specifically to practices that I've discussed today: soil health, nitrogen fertilizer stewardship, and conservation of riparian buffers, wetlands, and organic soils. You can check that plan out and see how that might work in your particular location. We've always got the USDA regional climate hubs to get information about these different practices. And then I've listed several resources. Some of them I used to make this presentation. Others I found useful as I've learned more about ecosystem-based mitigation. So that's what I have to present, and I think I have